Lyra had never asked for much. She had learned early that wanting too much only left more room for disappointment, so she kept her wishes small and quiet, folded up somewhere inside her chest where nobody could see them and laugh. She was 23 years old, and for 6 of those years she had lived inside the walls of the Ashvale Pack, first as an orphaned girl nobody quite knew what to do with, and later as a healer, the one who mixed the herbs and stitched the wounds and sat up all night with sick children so their mothers could sleep for an hour. She was good at her work. Everyone said so. The old healer who trained her, a woman named Odessa, with silver hair and hands that shook now, but had once been the steadiest in the pack, used to say that Lyra had a gift for knowing what hurt, before people even said it out loud. "You listen with your whole body," Odessa told her once. Most people only listen with their ears. Maybe that was true. Maybe that was why Lyra had heard the things she heard on that particular evening, when the sky over the Ashvale territory had gone the color of a bruise, and the wind smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. She had been carrying a satchel of yarrow root and crushed mallow leaves to the war room, because Draven Ashvale, the alpha king of the territory, had strained something in his shoulder during training that morning and refused, out of pure stubborn pride, to let anyone touch it until the evening council was finished. Lyra had been told to bring the herbs and wait outside until she was called in. This was normal. She had done this 100 times. She was, in the pack's eyes, useful in the way a chair is useful, or a lantern. Nobody thought twice about where she stood or how long she waited. She had been in love with him for 3 years. She had never told a single soul this, not even Odessa, not even the wolf pups who sometimes crawled into her lap during storms and asked her simple questions she wasn't brave enough to ask herself. It wasn't the kind of love that announced itself. It was quieter than that. It was the way she noticed when he skipped meals, because he was too buried in pack business to remember he had a body that needed feeding. It was the way she kept a jar of the tea he liked, the one with ginger and dark honey, always ready on the shelf closest to the door, just in case. It was the way she had memorized the sound of his footsteps in the hall, heavier on the left side because of an old injury nobody talked about, and how her heart did something small and embarrassing every single time she heard them coming closer. She told herself it didn't matter that he barely looked at her. Kings didn't look at healers the way healers looked at kings. That was simply how the world was built, and Lyra had never been the kind of girl who tried to argue with the shape of things. So she waited outside the war room that evening, satchel in hand, listening to the low murmur of voices through the heavy wooden door, and she was not trying to eavesdrop, not really. She was only standing there because that was where she had been told to stand. And then she heard her own name. It was strange, hearing your name said by someone who doesn't know you're close enough to hear it. There is a kind of honesty in that sound that doesn't exist anywhere else. People perform for an audience. They soften their words, round off the sharp edges, when they know someone might be listening. But when they believe they are alone, when they believe the only ears in the room belong to people who already agree with them, the words come out different, truer, uglier sometimes. "Lyra," Draven said, and his voice had none of the roughness he used when he was tired, none of the gentleness she had convinced herself she'd heard once or twice when he thanked her for tending a wound. This voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of a man discussing a supply problem. "She was a mistake," he said, "a weak link I never should have kept close." There was a pause. Someone, she thought it might be his younger brother, Cale, though she couldn't be certain through the door, made a small sound of agreement, or maybe it was just a throat being cleared. Someone else murmured something about how the healer's bloodline had never been strong, how her instincts ran soft where a warrior pack needed hard, how keeping her this close to the inner circle had always been a risk that hadn't paid off the way the old healer promised it would. Nobody defended her. Lyra stood very still outside that door, the satchel of yarrow root and crushed mallow leaves hanging from her fingers, and she found that she could not make her feet move in either direction. Not forward, to knock and deliver the herbs like she was supposed to, not backward, to walk away and pretend she had never heard a single word. She looked down at the satchel instead. There is a strange mercy in small, boring tasks when the ground falls out from under you. She began to count the bundles inside it, the way she always did before handing herbs over, a habit so old it lived somewhere below thought. 1 bundle of yarrow, 2, 3, she counted them again. Still 3. The number did not change no matter how many times she checked, and there was something almost comforting in that, in the fact that at least the yarrow root was behaving exactly the way yarrow root was supposed to behave, even while everything else in her chest was rearranging itself into a shape she didn't recognize. The voices inside the war room moved on to other matters, borders and patrol schedules, and a dispute with a neighboring pack over hunting rights, as easily as if they had just discussed the weather, as if what had been said about her was already finished, already filed away, already true and settled, and not worth revisiting. Lyra did not knock. She turned, and she walked back down the corridor, and she did not run, because running would have meant someone might notice her running, might ask why, might make her say the words out loud, and she did not think she could survive saying them out loud. Not yet, maybe not ever. She walked past the training grounds first, where the last of the evening light was catching on the dust that always hung in the air after a hard sparring session. She had spent more hours than she wanted to admit, standing near this fence with some excuse about herbs or salves, watching Draven move through his drills, telling herself it was only convenient timing, only coincidence, only a girl doing her job in the vicinity of a man doing his. She had built a small private hope here, brick by brick, over years, and now she looked at the empty training yard and felt that hope collapse in on itself, like a house made of wet paper. She walked past the courtyard next, where the moon was just beginning to show itself, pale and unbothered, hanging over the pack like it always did, like it always would, whether or not Lyra Vance existed to see it. She remembered standing here once, months ago, when Draven had walked past her on his way somewhere important and said, without stopping, without even really looking at her, "Good work with the Hendricks boys' fever." 4 words. That was all. She had turned that sentence over in her mind for a week afterward, like it was a gift someone had wrapped carefully just for her. 4 words. She had built entire daydreams on less. She walked past the healer's hall, where her own small room sat at the end, where the jar of ginger and dark honey tea still waited on the shelf closest to the door, ready for a man who thought she was a mistake he never should have kept close. She did not cry. That surprised her, a little, in some distant corner of her mind that was still capable of being surprised by anything. She had always imagined that if something like this happened, though she had never let herself imagine it clearly, never let the thought finish forming, she would cry. Instead, there was only a strange, heavy stillness, like the moment right before a storm breaks, when the whole sky holds its breath. She told herself it didn't matter that he barely looked at her. Kings didn't look at healers the way healers looked at kings. That was simply how the world was built, and Lyra had never been the kind of girl who tried to argue with the shape of things. There had been a moment, once, almost a year before the night everything changed, when she thought, just for a heartbeat, just for the length of a held breath, that maybe the shape of things wasn't quite as fixed as she'd always believed. It was late autumn, and Draven had come to the healer's hall himself instead of sending someone to fetch her, because a training accident had left a deep gash along his forearm and the pack's second healer had been away visiting family. Lyra had cleaned the wound in silence, the way she always worked, focused and careful, and he had watched her hands the entire time instead of looking away, or checking messages, or doing any of the 100 things a busy king might have found more urgent. "You don't talk much," he'd said, and it wasn't unkind, just observant, the way you might comment on the weather. "Not much worth saying while I'm working," she'd answered, not looking up from the stitches. "Talking makes my hands less steady." He'd laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, like he hadn't expected her to have an answer ready, let alone one with a bit of dry humor tucked inside it. "Fair enough," he'd said, and then quieter, almost to himself. "Most people around here talk entirely too much and say almost nothing at all." She had gone home that night and turned that exchange over in her mind more times than she wanted to admit, examining it from every angle the way she examined a wound to make sure she hadn't missed anything, It wasn't much. It certainly wasn't a declaration of anything, but it had felt, in the moment, like being seen as a person instead of a function, and Lyra had built entire quiet hopes on flimsier foundations than that. She understood now, looking back at it from the far side of everything that had happened since, that she had likely made far more of that evening than it had ever deserved. Kings noticed things sometimes. It didn't mean they valued them. She reached her room and closed the door behind her, and she stood there for a long moment with her back against the wood, looking at the small space that had been hers for 6 years. The narrow bed, the shelf of dried herbs labeled in her own careful handwriting, the little window that looked out over the eastern fields, where she used to watch the sun come up on mornings when she couldn't sleep. It was not much. It had never been much. But it had been hers, and for 6 years she had let herself believe that meant something, that being useful was close enough to being wanted, that proximity could someday, somehow, grow into something warmer. She had been wrong. She understood that now, with a clarity that felt almost merciful in its bluntness. There would be no growing. There would be no someday. There was only a war room full of men who had decided, without her, that she did not belong among them, and a king who had said the word mistake about her the way other men might say it about a bad decision in a business deal. She did not think about revenge. She was not built for that kind of fire. She did not think about walking back into that war room and demanding he say it to her face, watching him stumble over an apology he probably wouldn't mean, forcing the other men to look at her and feel whatever guilt they were capable of feeling. That was a different story, a louder one, and Lyra had never been loud in her life. She did not intend to start now, not even for this. Instead, she began very calmly to pack. It did not take long. A healer learns early how to live light, how to carry only what serves a purpose, because you never know when you might need to move quickly towards someone who is hurting. She packed dried herbs, sorted by use, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, yarrow for wounds. She packed a blanket, a water skin, a small knife she used mostly for cutting roots, but that would do well enough for other things if it had to. She packed 2 changes of clothes, sturdy boots, a flint for fire. She did not pack anything that had been given to her by the pack, nothing that carried Ashvale markings, nothing that would make her look, even for a moment, like she still belonged to something that had already decided she didn't. The pack medallion sat on her small wooden table, the one every member of the Ashvale territory wore, the one that marked her as protected, as claimed, as one of them. She picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it in her palm. The metal warmed slightly from where it always rested against her chest. She thought about leaving a note. She sat down, actually, with a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal, and she tried to think of words that would explain, without begging, that would say goodbye without asking anyone to feel sorry for her. But every sentence she started felt wrong, felt like it was reaching for something she no longer wanted to reach for. In the end, she set the charcoal down and simply placed the medallion in the center of her pillow instead, where it would catch the morning light through the little window, where whoever found it would understand without her having to explain a single thing. Some things say enough on their own. She paused at her door before she left, one hand on the frame, looking back at the small room one last time. Something in her chest did a strange folding thing, like a hand closing slowly around a candle flame, and for a moment she thought she might not be able to make herself walk through that door. 6 years was a long time to build a life, even a small one, even one that had turned out to matter to exactly nobody who mattered back. She did not go back inside to check if the feeling would pass. She simply turned and walked out and did not look behind her again. The Ashvale territory ended at the edge of a forest everyone in the pack called the Unclaimed Wilds, a stretch of dense, old trees that belonged to no pack, governed by no alpha, home to whatever creatures were desperate or fierce, or simply free enough to live there without protection. The stories about the Unclaimed Wilds were the kind mothers told children to keep them from wandering, talk of rogue wolves who had been cast out of their own packs for crimes too shameful to name, of hunters who set traps for anything that moved, of a cold that settled into your bones and never quite left, even after you found your way back to civilization. Nobody crossed into the wilds without an escort. Nobody crossed into the wilds alone. Lyra crossed into the wilds alone, on foot, in the deep dark of that same night, with nothing but a pack of dried herbs and a small knife, and a heart that had gone very quiet. She was not being brave. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, even as her boots pressed into the soft, unfamiliar ground beneath the tree line, even as the sounds of the Ashvale territory faded behind her and were replaced by the rustle and creak of a forest that did not know her name and did not care whether she lived or died in it. She was not being brave. She was simply choosing the kind of danger she could understand over the kind she couldn't. Being a mistake inside the pack, tolerated and quietly resented, had been survivable for 6 years because she had not known, not really, not with this much certainty, how little she was wanted. Now that she knew, staying felt impossible in a way the forest's dangers did not. The first night was the hardest. She found a hollow beneath the roots of an old, wide tree and built the smallest fire she dared, more for the light than the warmth, and she sat with her back against the bark and listened to a forest full of sounds she couldn't identify. Somewhere far off, something howled, low and mournful, and she found herself wondering, with a strange detachment, whether it was a wolf calling to its pack or a wolf calling because it no longer had one. She did not sleep much. She thought, instead, about the shape of the last 6 years, turning them over, the way you might turn over a stone, to see what had been living underneath it the whole time you'd been walking past. She thought about Odessa, who had died the winter before last, and who had told her, in one of her final lucid moments, "You give too much of yourself away for free, girl. One day you'll have nothing left, and they still won't have noticed you were giving anything at all." Lyra had brushed the words off at the time, the way you brush off advice that feels too true to sit with comfortably. She understood them differently now. She thought about Draven's voice, flat and businesslike, saying the word mistake, and she waited for the thought to hurt the way it had hurt outside that door. It did hurt. But underneath the hurt, something else was beginning to take shape, something that felt almost like relief, the relief of finally putting down a heavy thing you had been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it had weight at all. The days that followed blurred together in the particular way that survival blurs time. Lyra was at least good at the practical business of staying alive. 6 years of healing work had taught her which plants could be eaten and which would kill you, how to read weather in the shape of clouds, how to move quietly through undergrowth without announcing yourself to whatever might be listening. She built herself a small, hidden shelter against a rock face a few miles deeper into the wilds, using branches and packed mud and whatever else the forest offered, and she began, slowly, to construct a life out of almost nothing. She was not entirely alone out there, as it turned out. The unclaimed wilds held more people than the stories back home suggested. Not monsters, not the fearsome rogues of campfire tales, but people. Wolves who had left their packs for reasons of their own, some by choice, some by force, all of them carrying some version of the same quiet, careful wariness Lyra now wore like a second skin. She met a woman named Ines first, weeks into her time in the forest, an older shifter with a limp and a dry sense of humor who had been living alone in the wilds for nearly a decade after her own pack had turned on her for reasons she never fully explained. "Everybody out here's running from something," Ines told her, the first time they shared a fire, watching Lyra with the careful, assessing eyes of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust too quickly. "Question isn't whether you're running. Question's whether you're going to keep running forever, or whether you're going to stop somewhere and build something." Lyra didn't have an answer for that yet, but she found, over the following weeks, that Ines's fire became a place she returned to, and Ines's rough, unsentimental kindness became something steadying in a life that had otherwise come apart at every seam she used to hold on to. There was a particular morning, perhaps 6 weeks into her time in the forest, when Lyra woke to the sound of rain against the branches above her shelter and lay still for a long time before opening her eyes, listening to the water find its way down through layers of leaves until it reached the ground somewhere near her feet. Back in the pack house, rain had meant staying indoors, meant tea and dry blankets, and the particular comfort of walls that didn't leak. Here, rain meant checking whether her roof of packed mud and woven branches would hold, meant deciding whether to risk a fire at all or simply endure the cold until the clouds passed. She had cried that morning, finally, weeks after she thought the crying had already happened and finished without her noticing. It came on all at once, ugly and shaking, curled up under a leaking roof with her knees pulled to her chest, and she let it happen because there was nobody there to see it and feel awkward about it, nobody there to pat her shoulder in that stiff, uncertain way people do when they don't know what else to offer. When it passed, she felt lighter in a way she hadn't expected, not healed, not finished with grieving the life she'd left behind, but lighter, the way a person feels after finally setting down something heavy they've been carrying without realizing how much their arms had started to shake. Ines found her later that same day, soaked through and building a fire with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling, and the older woman didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat down beside her, added a few dry twigs from her own supply to the struggling flame, and waited until the fire caught before she spoke. "First good cry out here's always the worst one," Ines said. "Gets easier after that. Not because the hurt goes away, because you stop being scared of it." Lyra didn't answer, but she remembered those words for a long time afterward, turning them over on nights when sleep didn't come easily. Word of a healer living somewhere near the northern edge of the wilds began to spread among the scattered, loose community of exiles and wanderers who called that forest home, the way word always spreads among people who have nothing but each other. A man with a wound that wouldn't close came to her first, led by Ines, and Lyra cleaned and stitched it with hands that hadn't forgotten how, even if the rest of her still felt like it was made of scattered pieces. A child with a fever came next, carried by a mother who had heard whispers of a woman with gentle hands and quiet competence. Lyra sat up with that child the way she had sat up with 100 children before, in a pack that had never once thanked her properly for it, and she found, somewhere in the long hours of that vigil, that being needed by people who actually said so out loud felt different than being needed by people who called her a mistake behind closed doors. Slowly, without ever quite deciding to, Lyra began to build something. A small ramshackle healer's hut, made with help from hands that had once belonged to strangers and now belonged to something closer to friends. A garden of herbs, planted from seeds she'd carried in her satchel, and others she learned to identify and cultivate from Ines, who knew this forest the way Lyra had once known the corridors of the Ashvale pack house. A place in a community that had no king, no war room, no closed doors where men decided her worth without her in the room. More people found their way to her hut as the seasons turned. A young man named Torin arrived limping badly, having been thrown out of his birth pack for refusing an arranged mating he wanted no part of, and Lyra set his leg and let him stay in the small lean-to beside her garden until it healed, and then let him stay longer than that, because it turned out he had a talent for building things that her own hands had never quite mastered. He was the one who finally fixed the roof so it stopped leaking every time it rained. He was also, she came to learn, terribly bad at cooking anything more complicated than roasted roots, which became something of a running joke between the small, strange collection of people who had started gathering around her fire most evenings. There was a mother named Fenna, who came through with 2 small children, fleeing a mate who had grown cruel in ways nobody in his own pack had wanted to see, and Lyra gave her herbs for the younger child's cough, and more importantly, gave her a place to stay long enough to figure out where to go next. Fenna ended up staying through the whole winter. Her children, a boy and a girl who could not have been more than 6 and 8, took to following Lyra around the garden, asking endless questions about which plants did what, and Lyra found herself explaining things patiently, the way Odessa had once explained them to her, and there was something almost unbearably sweet in realizing she had become, without planning it, the kind of person someone else's children looked up to. None of it was easy. There were nights when supplies ran short, and everyone went to bed a little hungrier than they wanted to admit. There were arguments, the way there always are when people who don't share blood try to build something like a family out of nothing but proximity and shared circumstance. Ines and Torin disagreed constantly about how to fortify the small cluster of shelters that had begun to form around Lyra's hut, one of them favoring caution and the other favoring speed, and Lyra often found herself the quiet voice in the middle, the one both sides trusted enough to listen to even when they wouldn't listen to each other. But there was also laughter, more of it than Lyra had expected a life like this to hold. There were evenings around the fire when Torin told terrible jokes and Fenna's children shrieked with laughter anyway, and Ines would roll her eyes and mutter something dry under her breath that made everyone laugh harder, and Lyra would sit with a cup of something warm in her hands and think, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that she had not felt this settled in longer than she could remember, not even back when she still had a medallion and a room with 4 solid walls and a king whose footsteps she used to listen for like they meant something. She still thought of Draven. She would have been lying to herself if she claimed otherwise, and Lyra had never much cared for lying to herself. There were nights, sitting outside her hut with the smoke of her small fire curling up into a sky full of more stars than she remembered seeing back in the Pack territory, when she let herself remember the sound of his footsteps, heavier on the left side, and felt something in her chest twist with an old, familiar ache. But the ache came less often as the months passed, and when it came, it no longer arrived alone. It arrived alongside the memory of his flat, businesslike voice saying the word mistake, and the two memories together made a kind of balance that let her keep walking forward instead of turning back. Back in the Ashvale territory, the morning after Lyra vanished had unfolded very differently. Draven had gone looking for her without entirely admitting to himself why. It was not guilt, he told himself, at least not at first, or if it was guilt, it was a small, manageable kind, the sort you might feel for forgetting to thank someone for a favor, not the sort that kept a king awake at night. He simply noticed, over the course of that morning, a series of small absences. No tea waiting on the shelf when he passed the healer's hall out of habit, the ginger and dark honey blend he'd never told anyone he liked, but that always somehow appeared when he needed it most. No quiet footsteps in the corridor outside the war room at the hour herbs were usually delivered. A silence where a particular kind of steady, unremarkable presence used to be. He told himself it was nothing. He had a territory to run, borders to secure, a shoulder injury that still ached when he moved it a certain way. He did not have time to wonder about the whereabouts of a healer who delivered herbs and kept to herself and had never, in 6 years, given him any reason to think of her as anything other than useful. But by midday, when he found himself standing in the doorway of her small room, for reasons he could not entirely justify to anyone who might have asked, he found the answer waiting for him on the pillow, catching the light through the little window in a way that made the metal gleam almost gently, as though it were trying to soften the blow of what it meant. The medallion. Left behind. No note, no explanation needed, because the explanation was standing right there in the empty room around him. The bare shelf where dried herbs used to sit in careful rows, the narrow bed stripped of the single blanket she always kept folded at its foot, the particular, specific absence of a person who had spent 6 years being present in ways nobody had bothered to notice until she stopped. Draven stood in that doorway for a long time. He was not a man given to standing still. Stillness had never served him well, not in a life built around decisions and borders and the constant grinding work of holding a territory together. But he stood there anyway, and slowly, without wanting to, without inviting it, the shape of what he had said in the war room the previous evening reassembled itself in his mind. Not the way he had said it, careless and clipped, and meant for an audience of men who already agreed with him, but the way it must have sounded from the other side of a closed door, to someone standing close enough to hear every word. He had not known she was outside. That was true, and it mattered to him, in the moment, in a way that surprised him with its intensity. The desperate need to believe that if he had known, he would have said something different, would have chosen kinder words, would have caught himself before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. But even as he reached for that thought, some more honest part of him recognized it for what it was. He had meant every word he'd said, in that moment, in that room. He simply hadn't expected to have to answer for meaning it. He did not go after her that day. The unclaimed wilds did not forgive trespass lightly, and a king did not cross into rogue territory alone, not without risking the very stability he had spent years building. He told himself this was practical wisdom, not cowardice, though the line between the two felt thinner than he wanted to admit, as he stood in a room that no longer smelled like dried yarrow and crushed mallow leaves. In a pack house that had gone strangely, uncomfortably quiet, in ways he was only now beginning to notice. Weeks passed, then months. Draven ran his territory the way he always had, efficiently, decisively, the way a king was supposed to. But there were small moments, scattered through the ordinary business of his days, when the absence caught up with him unexpectedly, reaching for a shelf that no longer held a jar of tea he'd never asked for and never thanked anyone for providing, walking past a healer's hall now run by an assistant who was competent but who did not know, the way Lyra had known, exactly how much willow bark a particular child could tolerate, or which of his men flinched from being touched on the left side because of an old fight nobody talked about anymore. That conversation sat with Draven for a long time afterward, the way certain truths do, refusing to be filed away or forgotten no matter how much a person might want them to be. He began, slowly, to understand something about himself that he had never had cause to examine before, that he had grown so used to being surrounded by people who existed to serve his needs that he had stopped noticing the difference between service and personhood, between someone being useful to him and someone being a whole, feeling human being with a life of her own that did not orbit around his. He started small, the way people usually do when they are trying to change something rooted deeper than habit. He began thanking people out loud for things he had always simply expected. The guard who opened the gate for him each morning, the cook who remembered he didn't take salt with his eggs, the young healer's assistant who had taken over Lyra's old duties and who flinched, the first few times when he stopped to say the words. He noticed how strange it felt, at first, to say thank you to people whose job it technically was to serve him, and he noticed, too, how that strangeness told him something uncomfortable about the kind of king he had allowed himself to become. He asked Kale, one evening months later, why nobody else in that war room had said a word in her defense either, and Kale had looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because we all took our cue from you," his brother said. "You set the tone in that room, brother, always have. If you'd said one kind thing about her, the rest of us would have found something kind to say too. You didn't, so we didn't. That's on all of us, but it started with you." It was not a comfortable thing to sit with, but Draven found that he had stopped avoiding uncomfortable things by then. He began paying closer attention to the small, unnoticed people who kept his territory running, the ones who fixed the fences and mended the roofs and sat up nights with sick children, the ones whose names he had never bothered to learn because they had never needed learning for the pack to function. He started learning their names. He also began, quietly, without telling anyone at first, sending supplies toward the edges of the unclaimed wilds. Not directly to Lyra. He did not yet know exactly where she was, and even if he had, he understood he had no right to intrude on whatever life she was building. But he arranged, through traders who moved between territories, for medicine and blankets and dried food to reach the loose, scattered communities of exiles who lived out there with nothing and no one looking out for them. It was a small thing. It did not undo anything he had said. But it was, he told himself, a start, a way of proving to himself, if to no one else, that the lesson had actually taken root and wasn't simply guilt dressed up as good intentions. He asked about her, eventually, carefully, in ways that tried not to look like asking. Kale, his younger brother, was the one who finally said what nobody else had been willing to say out loud. "You know she heard you," Kale told him one evening, months after that night, when the two of them were alone and the wine had loosened something in both of them. That night, in the war room, she was standing right outside the door with the herbs for your shoulder. Half the pack knows it now. She left the medallion. She didn't run off because of some rogue wolf or a bad dream, brother. She ran because of what you said, and because none of us said a single word to stop it." Draven did not respond to that for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the flatness it had carried in the war room that night. "Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" "Because you didn't ask sooner," Kale said. "You were too busy telling yourself it wasn't your problem to solve." That conversation sat with Draven for a long time afterward, the way certain truths do, refusing to be filed away or forgotten, no matter how much a person might want them to be. He began, slowly, to understand something about himself that he had never had cause to examine before, that he had grown so used to being surrounded by people who existed to serve his needs that he had stopped noticing the difference between service and personhood, between someone being useful to him and someone being a whole, feeling human being with a life of her own that did not orbit around his. It took him the better part of a year to work up the courage to cross into the unclaimed wilds himself. He went alone, in the end, against the advice of nearly everyone who counseled him, because he understood, somewhere along the way, that showing up with guards and an entourage would only prove he had learned nothing at all. A king with soldiers at his back was still a king demanding something. A man alone, walking into unfamiliar and dangerous territory with nothing but the hope that he might be allowed to say a few words, was something closer to an apology that meant what it said. He found the healer's hut near the northern edge of the wilds, after several days of careful searching, following whispers and rumors, the way he had once followed battle reports, piecing together the location of a small garden of herbs and a woman with gentle hands who had built something out of nothing among people who had nowhere else to go. Lyra was outside her hut when he found her, kneeling in her garden with dirt on her hands, tending to a row of chamomile that had just begun to flower. She heard him before she saw him, some old instinct, some memory of footsteps heavier on the left side, made her go very still before she turned around. She did not run this time. She had already done her running, months ago, in the dark, alone, and she found, looking at him standing at the edge of her garden with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 6 years of knowing him, that she was not afraid of him anymore, not in any way that mattered. "You shouldn't be here," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. "I know," he said. "I came anyway." They stood like that for a long moment, the space between them full of everything that had happened in the year since a war room door had separated a man's careless words from the ears of the person they were about to wound. Draven did not ask her to come back. He understood, somewhere in that year of quiet, uncomfortable self-examination, that he had no right to ask for anything yet, that showing up was only the first small step of a debt that would take far longer than a single conversation to repay, if it could be repaid at all. Instead, he said the only thing he had walked days through dangerous, unclaimed territory to say. "I was wrong. About all of it. You were never a mistake. I said something ugly and careless in a room I thought was private, and I let it stand unanswered because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand what I had, right in front of me, for 6 years." Lyra listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she had always listened to everyone, with her whole body, the way Odessa had taught her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that held both the old ache and something new, something steadier, something that had grown in her the way her garden had grown in soil that belonged to nobody but her. "I built a life out here," she said finally. "It's small, it's not much compared to what I had, but it's mine, and nobody in it has ever once made me feel like an inconvenience they were tolerating." "I'm not asking you to give that up," Draven said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know, that I was wrong, that whatever you choose to do with that, it's yours to choose, not mine to decide for you." Behind her, the small camp had gone quiet, in that particular way, a place goes quiet when its people are pretending not to listen. Torrin stood near the fence he'd built, arms crossed, watching the stranger with open suspicion. Inez had appeared in the doorway of her own shelter, saying nothing, her weight resting on her good leg, ready to move if she needed to. Fenna had pulled her 2 children a little closer, the way a mother does on instinct even when there's no clear danger yet. Lyra was aware of all of them without turning to look, aware of the fact that she was no longer a woman, standing alone in a garden, facing the man who had once decided her worth, without her in the room. She had people at her back now. That mattered more than she could have explained to him, even if she'd tried. "You walked here alone," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I didn't think I had the right to bring anyone else," Draven said. "Didn't think I had the right to make this about protecting myself, when it was never your job to make anything easier for me in the first place." Something in Lyra's chest loosened slightly at that. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized effort when effort was real. "You could have died out here," she said. "Alone. Unclaimed territory. No backup. That was reckless." "Probably," he agreed. Seemed fair, given what I'd already lost by being careless with words instead. She almost smiled at that, though she caught it before it fully formed, unwilling to give away more than she meant to just yet. "You've changed the way you talk," she observed. "I've had a year to think about how I used to talk," he said. Didn't much like what I found when I finally looked at it honestly. They stood in that quiet for a while longer, the garden between them, the small collected life she had built pressing in gently at the edges of the conversation without ever quite interrupting it. Lyra looked at the chamomile she'd been tending when he arrived, its small white flowers just beginning to open toward whatever sun made it through the canopy overhead, and she thought about how long it had taken this particular row to grow from seed to bloom, how much patient, unglamorous work had gone into something that now looked, from a distance, almost effortless. "I'm not the same person who left that room with your medallion on my pillow," she said finally. "I don't think I'd go back to being her, even if you asked me to." "I'm not asking you to be her," Draven said. "I only came to say I was wrong, and to leave whatever happens next entirely in your hands. That's all. That's the whole of it." He did not stay long after that. He understood, in the way he had come to understand many things over the past year, that some apologies are not owed a reward, that saying a true thing out loud can matter even when it changes nothing about where 2 people stand afterward. He turned to leave the way he had come, back through the unclaimed wilds, back toward a territory that had learned to run without a healer, who had once kept it steadier than anyone gave her credit for. Lyra watched him go, standing at the edge of her garden with dirt still on her hands, and she found that the ache in her chest, the old familiar one, had finally settled into something she could carry without it breaking her stride. She did not call after him. She did not ask him to stay, and she did not ask herself to follow. Inez came to stand beside her once he had disappeared fully into the tree line, saying nothing at first, just watching the empty space where the king of the Ashvale territory had been standing moments before. "You didn't go with him," Inez said eventually. "It wasn't a question either." "No," Lyra said. "Any regrets about that?" Lyra thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything now, without flinching away from whatever answer she found. "Not the kind you're asking about," she said. "There's a part of me that'll probably always wonder what it would have looked like, going back, starting over, with him actually seeing me this time. But wondering isn't the same as wanting it enough to give this up." She gestured, a small motion that took in the garden, the hut, the sound of Fenna's children laughing somewhere near Torrin's newly repaired fence. "I built this. Nobody handed it to me because they finally noticed I was useful. I built it because I had to, and then because I wanted to, and I'm not sure I've ever felt that particular kind of proud about anything before." Inez nodded slowly, the way she did when she approved of something without wanting to make a fuss about approving of it. "Good," she said. "That's the right kind of ending then. Not every story needs the girl going back to the castle." That evening, the fire burned late, the way it often did, and the small collection of people who had found their way to Lyra's corner of the unclaimed wilds gathered around it the way they always did, trading stories and terrible jokes and quiet observations about the day. Lyra sat among them with a cup of something warm in her hands, watching the flames, and she thought about the version of herself who had once counted bundles of yarrow root outside a closed door, trying to hold herself together with nothing but arithmetic. That version of her had believed, for 6 long years, that being tolerated was close enough to being loved, that usefulness could someday grow into belonging if she just waited patiently enough and asked for little enough in return. It had taken losing everything, a room, a title, a medallion, a king who called her a mistake without knowing she could hear him, for her to learn the difference between the two. Belonging, she understood now, was not something you earned by making yourself small and convenient. It was something that grew, slowly and honestly, among people who chose you back, out loud, without needing to be asked. She had that now. It had cost her nearly everything to find it, and she would not have chosen the path that led here if she'd had any other way to see it clearly. But sitting by that fire, surrounded by a family she had built herself out of nothing but dirt and dried herbs and the stubborn refusal to disappear, Lyra thought that perhaps some doors were only ever meant to close so that better ones could finally open. And somewhere behind her, disappearing into the tree line hours earlier, the man who had once called her a mistake carried the truth of his own words back into a life that would never quite fit the same way again, now that he finally understood exactly what he had lost the night he forgot to check whether the door was closed.